Hi folks, Chapter 6, Conformity and Obedience. As you can see, there's two quotes here on the slide, and you can read them yourself and see which one you agree with. I think a lot of people in the class are probably going to be thinking of conformity as something bad or negative, but in reality, conformity is neither good nor bad. And hopefully, by the time you finish reading this chapter and browsing over this very brief slideshow, you'll have a new appreciation for what conformity is and is not. So what is conformity? And when we answer this question, we want to look at it from the point of view of a social psychologist. Next, what are the classic conformity and obedience studies? Keep in mind, we're only going to look at about 3 studies, 3 experiments, but there's many more. These are the classics. 3, what predicts conformity? So under what circumstances are you likely to conform? 4, why conform? So why do people conform anyway? Why would you change who you are to go along with the crowd? 5, who conforms? Does everyone conform? Is it a matter of personality, culture? Is it about the social roles that we play? And then 6, do we ever want to be different? Are we all just conformists, or are there times when we want to assert our uniqueness? So what is conformity? Social psychologists define conformity as a change in behavior or belief to accord with others. So there can be real or imagined pressure, group pressure to change, but essentially you're changing your actions and you're being influenced by others. All right. So social psychologists tend to separate conformity into at least 2 parts, acceptance and compliance. Now, obedience is kind of a special type of conformity, and it's usually related to compliance. So with acceptance, this is where you change your behavior or your belief to accord with others, and you're changing your behavior outwardly or your beliefs, and inwardly you really agree with this change. That's acceptance. Compliance, on the other hand, is where you change your behavior, belief, so outwardly you look different, you're being different, but inwardly you don't agree with this change. All right, so you can see how with acceptance, you are accepting the behavior, and with compliance, you're simply being compliant. Now, an example of acceptance would be, suppose you were in the military, you joined the military, and as a military member, you notice that everyone is keeping a clean face. So you actually, shave, and you think you look pretty good with this clean face. And so you're like, I like this. And so even when you get out of the military, you continue to shave and keep a clean face. This would be an example of acceptance. Compliance, on the other hand, would be if you were in the military and you found out that you looked around and you saw everyone was wearing their face shaved, but you didn't like the way you looked with your face shaved, but you changed because other people were doing it. So you did it because you kind of had to. So you changed your behavior outwardly, but inside you were like, nah, I think I look better with the goatee or with the mustache. So that would be the difference between acceptance and compliance. Now, obedience, the only difference with obedience is that there's a direct order to comply. So if your first shirt or someone higher ranking than you says, hey, you have to shave your face, then that would be obedience. And so quite often the case with compliance is people are obeying orders, they're following a direct order, and so they are outwardly changing their behavior, but inwardly they still think or believe how they did before they made the change. What are the classic conformity and obedience studies? Summing up, Muzaffar Sharif observed that others' judgments influence people's estimates of the movement of a point of light that actually did not move. Norms for proper answers emerged and survived both over long periods of time and through succeeding generations of research participants. Solomon Asch had people listen to others' judgments of which of 3 comparison lines was equal to a standard line and then make the same judgment themselves. When the others unanimously gave a wrong answer, the participants conformed 30% of the time. Stanley Milgram's studies of obedience elicited an extreme form of compliance. Under optimum conditions, a legitimate close-at-hand commander, a remote victim, and no one else to exemplify disobedience, 65% of his adult male participants fully obeyed instructions to deliver what were supposedly traumatizing electric shocks to a screaming, innocent victim in an adjacent room. Behavior and attitudes are mutually reinforcing, enabling a small act of evil to foster the attitude that leads to a bigger evil act. So in these three classic studies, we found out a little bit about norm formation, so how norms get started, group pressure, under what circumstances are we likely to succumb to the pressure of our peers, or strangers for that matter, and then obedience to authority. And I want to give you just a little blurb about these three researchers, because not a lot is known about Muzafer Sherif and Solomon Asch. So in terms of Muzafer Sherif, he was a Turkish social psychologist. He was born in 1906 in Turkey, and he died in 1988. And he did his research on social norms and perception at Columbia University in 1935. And he's most famous for his Robbers Cave experiment, which looked at intergroup relations, and that happened in 1954. And then the experiment that is previewed in this chapter, dealing with the autokinetic phenomenon, or autokinetic effect, when showing how norms get started. But he also studied things like reference groups and the self and social judgment, communication, in addition to, attitude formation and attitude change. So Muzafer Sherif was a brilliant social psychologist. He was a political activist. And if you really study his life, he grew up in a time of tremendous turmoil. And some of his self-reports say that he's surprised that he was able to survive through everything that he experienced and witnessed in his lifetime. The next researcher that I want to mention is Solomon Asch. And Solomon Asch has a quote here that you can read on the slide. It says, the tendency to conformity in our society is so strong that reasonably intelligent and well-meaning young people are willing to call white black. This is a matter of concern. And, his research is relevant to this day. But Solomon Asch, he was heavily influenced by the Gestalt psychologist and cognitive psychology, and in particular, he studied under Max Wertheimer. Asch was born in Poland, and he also earned his degree at Columbia University back in 1932. Last but not least, we want to look at Stanley Milgram. Stanley Milgram was very much influenced by the events that happened in the Holocaust, and he himself obtained his degree from Harvard University, but he's most famous for his research at Yale on the obedience studies. And you can actually purchase a copy of Obedience to Authority for only $5 and read about the 24 different versions of his classic studies. Or when we stop social distancing, you can check it out from the library. Milgram studies. The ethics of Milgram studies and what breeds obedience. So Milgram studies were very controversial, and you had a lot of people in the general population and even some psychologists who believed that Milgram violated the rights of the human subjects that participated in his experiments. Milgram himself believed that what we learned from the experiment was worth the pressure or the threat to self-esteem that the subjects experienced. And a quote provided on page 152 in the textbook reads as follows: "There is less consequence to subjects in this experiment from the standpoint of effects on self-esteem than to university students who take ordinary course examinations and who do not get the grades they want. It seems that in giving exams, we're quite prepared to accept stress, tension, and consequences for self-esteem. But in regard to the process of generating new knowledge, how little tolerance we show." You can clearly see that Milgram was unapologetic about the procedures he used to ask the question and find answers to the questions that he asked about obedience to authority. Now, some of the complaints about the ethics behind Milgram's study relate to informed consent. So, as you know, informed consent is foundational in conducting research with human subjects. You have to tell your subjects enough about the experiment so that they can decide whether or not they want to be a part of it. And some of the critics argued that what Milgram told them wasn't enough for people to truly give their informed consent. Another criticism is that Milgram did not protect his subjects from harm. So even though he wasn't submitting the subjects to physical harm, he was subjecting them to emotional harm. And critics believe that he should have taken better care of the subjects with, keeping them from feeling this emotional distress. And another criticism is that Milgram, when he did the debriefing, he didn't provide enough actual information afterwards. And so debriefing occurs if you use deception. In this case, Milgram did use deception. And keep in mind, about 30% of social psychology experiments involve the use of deception. So he deceived the participants because he told them, hey, you're going to be taking part in this experiment on the effects of punishment on learning. And in fact, he was looking at, obedience to authority. Now, in Milgram's defense, he said he did tell them what they would have to do, whether or not you may or may not have to shock someone. So he did tell them that. But the critics argued that, they still needed to know more. And that when he debriefed them at the end, his debriefing was a little bit shoddy. Now, these are some of the criticisms surrounding Milgram's studies of obedience in terms of how ethical it was. But some of the takeaways are what the factors that actually breed obedience. And because Milgram did a lot of different versions of his experiment, he came up with 4 different factors that tend to breed obedience to authority. Number 1 is the victim's distance. So in one version of the experiment, the subject had to actually place a participant's hand on a touch or a shock generator. And so in this condition, when subjects were, the emotional distance of the victim was close, then, it was harder for subjects to inflict the pain. So they were less likely to follow orders, more likely to disobey if the emotional distance of the victim is close. In the contrast, there was a condition of the experiment in which participants didn't hear the subject's cries, so the emotional distance was like very far, in which case they just obeyed the authority figure and continued to shock to the bitter end. Another factor that breeds obedience is the closeness and legitimacy of the authority figure. So if you perceive an authority figure as legitimate, and if their presence is there and looming, then you're more likely to obey that authority figure. Just think about it yourself. If you're driving on the road and the speed limit sign is posted and you should be going 65 or 70, but everybody's going 80, all right? And if you see a police officer, and he is close, you're more likely to get in line and follow the speed limit because that authority figure is close and they're legitimate. Now, if a person drives by you and tells you to go the speed limit, are you really going to follow that person's instructions because you may not perceive that person as a legitimate authority figure? Now, the third factor that breeds obedience is the liberating effects of group influence. And this comes from a version of Milgram's experiment when he had participants, the participants had a confederate, so someone who's in on it with the experimenter, who defied or disobeyed the authority figure. And in this situation, participants were more likely to disobey the authority figure if their comrade, the confederate, also disobeyed the authority figure. So sometimes group pressure can be for the good. And last but not least is institutional authority. And in another version of Milgram's classic study, he conducted the experiments in Bridgeport, Connecticut, in a modest building. And in that modest building, people were less likely to shock than when he conducted the experiments affiliated with Yale University. And so in this situation, he's showing that the institution itself holds a bit of power and authority and legitimacy. And so people are going to be more likely to obey authority if there's an institution backing, the authority. Okay, so what can we learn about human behavior from reviewing these classic studies? We're going to give 3 real-life examples. The first was norm formation, and the researcher was Muzafer Sharif. And here on the slide it says interpreting events differently after hearing from others or appreciating a tasty food that others love. The example I thought of was the Popeye's chicken craze. For a while it was all the rage and there were tons of memes and hashtags, and the lines to get this sandwich were, off the chain. Okay, so that's one example. For conformity, The researcher was Solomon Asch, and the example would be doing as others do, such as fads such as tattoos. I would even give the example of the nose ring that I have, getting my septum pierced. I've had my nose pierced since I was in high school, and I've always been someone who maybe was into things that might be considered on the fringe, but I never really got my septum pierced. But this would be an example of conformity. I could say it would be acceptance because I've changed my behavior and I agree that it looks cute, but nonetheless, I have conformed. If you look at the amount of people who have septum piercings now compared to maybe 15, 20 years ago, you're going to see that that number is spiked considerably. And then the last one is obedience. The researcher was Stanley Milgram, and an example would be soldiers or employees following questionable orders. There's a really good book by Phil Zimbardo, and Phil Zimbardo is the researcher, the social psychologist out of Stanford University who did the Stanford prison study. He wrote a book called The Lucifer Effect, and he talks about his firsthand experiences with his 1971 Stanford prison study, and he compares it to what happened in the Middle East, where we had American soldiers who were not thoroughly trained, who did some pretty horrific things to prisoners. And you know, there's a lot of striking parallels, but it's a really good example of obedience to authority. So these are some of the things that we can learn from reviewing these classic studies. So what predicts conformity? In the summing up section, it says certain situations appear to be especially powerful for eliciting conformity. For example, people conform most when 3 or more people model the behavior or belief. Conformity is reduced if the modeled behavior or belief is not unanimous, if 1 or more people dissent. Conformity is enhanced by group cohesion, and the higher the status of those modeling the behavior or belief, the greater likelihood of conformity. People also conform most when their responses are public or in the presence of the group, and a prior commitment to a certain behavior or belief increases the likelihood that a person will stick with that commitment. Now, on these 2 short clips, one is from the video or the movie Mean Girls, and it's very short, but it's a good example of conformity, and in particular, when the person has status, how the group is likely to conform. So in this particular clip, this character she's conforming because of Katie Harris, who, as you know, if you've seen the movie Mean Girls, Katie has acquired some level of status. And in the other clip here, this is a clip from 12 Angry Men. It's about 3 minutes long. And watch the clip and see if you can identify any of these triggers for conformity. Why conform? Now, you may say there's lots of different reasons to conform, but social psychologists have narrowed it down to 2 broad reasons why people tend to change their behavior or belief to accord with others. One is due to normative social influence, and 2 is because of informational social influence. So normative social influence is when you want to gain acceptance. So you go along to get along. You don't want to be the odd one out. An example of this would be, there's an activity I used to do in class where I give everybody a piece of paper with different tasks to do. For example, stand up, face the rear, clap your hands. And usually when I do this activity, I'll give everybody something that involves standing up, and then I'll give one person a slip of paper that says remain seated. Now that person who has the slip of paper that says remain seated, it's really hard for them to go against the crowd. So they may want to stand up and blend in, right? Because they don't want to feel awkward or different or set apart. So this would be, if they stood up to just avoid that feeling awkward, that would be normative influence. Now, for informational social influence, this is when you conform because you believe that everybody else has some information that you don't have. So perhaps you look on the piece of paper and you think, well, maybe I misunderstood, there's something I missed. Maybe she didn't finish writing out the instructions, and you feel like you want to find out or accept other people's view of reality. So you can tell the difference between normative and informational social influence by looking at the word. So in the word normative social influence, you see the word norm, right? And in the word informational social influence, you see the word information. So with normative social influence, you're trying to keep up with the norm. And with informational social influence, you're trying to be informed or get some information. Who conforms? So the summing up section says, people who seek to please others and are comfortable following social rules, which would include those who are high in agreeableness and conscientiousness, are the most likely to conform. And although conformity and obedience are universal, different cultures socialize people to be more or less socially responsive. And finally, social roles involve a certain degree of conformity, and conforming to expectations is an important task when stepping into a new social role. So on this slide, I've included a picture that has the big five personality traits. And as you can see, each of these big five personality traits are supposedly present in every person across the entire globe. And the theory, Big Five theorist, which was popularized by Costa McCrae, says that essentially these super traits, each person varies to some degree on these super traits. So you may be more or less open to new experiences. You may be more or less agreeable, more or less conscientious. You may be introverted or extroverted, and you may be high or low in neuroticism. And another term for neuroticism is emotional stability. So if you're very neurotic, then you're not very emotionally stable. But if you're not very neurotic, then you're very emotionally stable. So the research basically shows that if you're high in conscientiousness or agreeableness, then you're going to be more likely to conform. And obviously you're conforming for different reasons. For agreeableness, people are conforming because they want to fit in with the crowd, right? They're like a people pleaser. Now, besides personality, there's also culture. And people from collectivistic cultures are socialized to value group solidarity, whereas people from individualistic cultures are taught to value individualism, so being unique, standing out. And you can think back to our discussion in Chapter 2 on an independent versus an interdependent construal of the self, and how some people are going to be more likely to view themselves as connected to others, and others are going to be more likely to view themselves as set apart. All right. And there's, if you go back to Chapter 2 and read Chapter 2 in our textbook, there's tons of videos and discussions by Hazel Marcus and Alana Connor who talk about these different aspects of culture and how they might shape or form conformity. Last but not least, social roles. We all play a lot of different roles in our lives. You know, I may play the role of mother, teacher, friend, daughter, and in each of those roles, it requires something different of me. And so essentially, I am conforming, or I'm likely to conform to the expectations that are set up with each particular role. And the same is true for you. Do we ever want to be different? Explain what can motivate people to actively resist social pressure by doing Z when pressured to do A. So your textbook authors talk about two different instances of when we want to be different. One, reactance, and two, asserting uniqueness. So individuals value their sense of freedom and their self-efficacy. And so remember, self-efficacy is your ability to be competent to, accomplish goals. And sense of freedom is like you want to feel like you have power. Okay. So the theory of psychological reactance says that people act to protect their sense of freedom, and is supported by experiments showing that attempts to restrict a person's freedom often produce an anti-conformity boomerang effect. So basically, if you try to force someone to do something, quite often they may end up doing the opposite of what you're trying to force them to do. And then the second one, asserting our uniqueness, this is talking about how even though we want to be different, we also have, we want to be the same, but we don't want to be exactly the same, especially in individualistic cultures. We want to be just a little bit different. So there's a really good quote on page 170, and it says, "When I'm in America, I have no doubt I'm a Jew, but I have strong doubts about whether I'm really an American. And when I get to Israel, I know I'm an American, but I have strong doubts about whether I'm a Jew." This is by Leslie Fidler back in 1991. And you can think about this quote and ask yourself, are there times when you are the only male or the only female? And are you conscious? Are you aware that you're the only? And are there times when, you're with people who are just like you and you're unaware of your difference. Great, we've made it to the end of the slideshow. And so when we're talking about conformity and obedience from the stance of social psychology, we want to remember that conformity can be good, it can be bad, or it can be inconsequential. There are times when, conforming to others is beneficial, and there are times when not conforming to others is beneficial. So social psychologists believe that conformity is just to change your behavior to accord with others. And there are some classic studies that we went over. So we talked about Muzafer-Sherry's study on norm formation. We looked at Solomon Ash's study on group pressure, and Stanley Milgram's studies on obedience to authority. And these classic studies give us a good idea of what conformity is, what obedience looks like, and why we should study it. Okay, so we figured out that there are some factors that predict conformity, and we know that personality and culture and social roles also determine who's going to conform. And there's going to be times when, despite the pressure to fit in, we still may want to be just a little bit different. So please watch the videos that are available in Canvas. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to email me, and I'll be happy to try to provide a little additional clarity.